Hello, everyone, and welcome back to what I believe is our fourth video in this installment of me going through this repository, which hopefully by now many of you are familiar with it. It's this Florin Pop 17 slash app ideas. So just to give a really quick recap for anyone that's new to the channel, my objective, something that I want to do is while I'm also learning a lot of new things in web development, I figured that doing these projects are a good way to apply some of those newfound skills. So I really want to be very meticulous with this and try and do all these different beginner projects from tier one. And once we've passed that, go to tier two and then finally tier three. So it's going to be a lot of content. It's going to be a lot of fun for not only me, but hopefully everyone watching. And what I've pretty much been doing is I randomly pick one of these and I'll go for it. And that's how I structure my video. Something new that I've recently tried is I split it up into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript parts. I think it makes it easier for viewers to focus on smaller pieces, and just that focus, I think, makes it an easier development process for everyone involved. And it also helps me out too, just in the sense of editing the video, recording it, so on and so forth. So the app I landed on today is one that I'm pretty excited about. It's called Notes app. So just like we've been doing previously, let's just go ahead and get started and let's read the README here or the markdown for this application. So it's a Notes app. It's tier one beginner. It says to create and store your notes for a later purpose. So here are our user stories. User can create a note, user can edit a note, user can delete a note, and when closing the browser window, the notes will be stored, and when the user returns, the data will be retrieved. Bonus features, user can create and edit a note in Markdown format. On save, it will convert Markdown to HTML. User can see the date when he created the note. So probably what I'll do is we'll of course be going through all these user stories as we start creating the application. And then at the end, even for example, we'll have HTML, CSS, JavaScript. The JavaScript section will contain just the user stories outlined here. And then after that, we'll probably have the bonus section where we'll focus on these bonus features here for anyone that's interested. And of course, they give us some useful links and resources like local storage, which we'll be using when we want to store these features, rather store the notes so that we can later retrieve them. We'll be using this Markdown guide and mark to Markdown parser, presumably for the bonus feature section, where we'll create and edit a note in Markdown format. I don't want to look at the example projects because I think it's better for us just to really start from scratch, not have any preconceived notions of what this app will look like. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are in the HTML section where we're going to start creating the structure of our note-taking application. So what I've already done is I created a new folder and I called that folder Note Taker. Inside of the Note Taker folder, I have one single index HTML. And what I did to get this nice HTML5 scaffold, if some of you are not familiar, with Visual Studio Code, you get this thing called Emmet. And Emmet is a nice shorthand way to get a lot of these HTML5 compliant code snippets, which helps you create your code a lot faster, definitely increasing the developer experience. So by simply typing in a single exclamation mark, you can see that here it says Emmet abbreviation. And if we click on enter, we get this nice starter HTML5 compliant HTML code. And I can come here and I can change this to note taker. That's the title that I want to give to this application. And from here, we can go ahead and get started. For anyone that's new on this application or new on this channel rather, I'm using a extension for Visual Studio Code called Live Server, which I can show you all right here. Live Server is a great way to get started developing. What it essentially does is it starts a server in your current directory and it allows you to do fast reloads as you're developing. So you'll see that as I'm developing, I don't actually need to go to my browser and do a manual refresh. Sometimes I may do that for different reasons. Maybe there's some sort of issue. Maybe Live Server just conked out. But for the most part, I would say 99% of the time, Live Server works out beautifully and it will automatically do these reloads for you. So you don't even have to worry about refreshing your page. You can just quickly and iteratively start your development process. So the first thing I want to do here before we even get started is I want to create a Git repository from this directory. So I'm going to do that by typing in git init, and now you can see that it says initialized empty Git repository in this directory of mine. So now what we can do is we can start creating these snapshots as we go along. If this is your first time on the channel, or even if it isn't, you know that one thing I really enjoy doing is I like creating commits early and often, but I need to make sure that they are complete commits. And what do I mean by complete commits? Well, you don't want to create a commit that's incomplete, because if you need to revert back to that state and things aren't working properly, it might actually confuse you more so than if you just get to a point where things are working. That way, if you do go back, if you do revert, you're starting off at a solid foundation instead of a crumbled one. It's just something to keep in mind. Hopefully, that's imparting some wisdom onto everyone here. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So let's look at the user stories real quick just to remind ourselves of what we have to do. So user can create a note, user can edit a note, user can delete a note. When closing the browser window, the notes will be stored, and when the user returns, the data will be retrieved. So it seems like most of this is going to be focused on JavaScript. So before we even get to the JavaScript, we have to create a way for our notes to render. Now I'm thinking to myself, I think it would be neat if we had sort of like a grid system, and each one of the different nodes were just some sort of rectangle, and I think it would make it very clear how we can go about creating our different nodes and actually viewing them. I think the grid system would be nice. So I'm thinking to have some sort of header, and then of course my grid system underneath where everything will be laid out. So let's go ahead and start doing that. And because this is live, I mean, at the time of me recording this, I haven't really prepared anything. So we're just going to go through it together and figure out how it's going to work as we go along. So like I mentioned, the first thing I want is just some sort of header to signify what this application is for. So I'll just call it note taker. And underneath this, I know I'm going to have a section, and this section is going to comprise of my grid. And then in that section, I will have all my different grid components, which in these cases will be different nodes. Now, if you've seen some of my earlier HTML videos, since we're going to be using, well, by the way, we are going to be using raw JavaScript for this, so we're not going to be using some single page application framework like React or Vue or Angular. So I think this is a cool way to go about this. It really focuses your attention on what's happening underneath the hood. Now, if you are all somewhat familiar with JavaScript, when you're creating elements in JavaScript, you're going to be using a create element method on the document object. And this is okay, but if you've worked with it before, you know that, let's say you want to create a div, you have to create element div, and then if you want to create a child, you have to append the child to that div, and then you have to append all that stuff to some other component, and you have to add all the attributes you want for all the different elements, and then finally append that to, let's say, our section here. So it's a lot of very, I suppose, imperative programming. It's very surgical. It's prone to errors. So what I like to do is I actually like to create something called a template. And the template is nice because it gives us a blueprint to work with. Think of it as a factory we can just pull from every single time. Essentially, the template allows for the element to already be created. We just have to fill in the blanks. So let's take a second to think about what that means. I'm going to go ahead and create my template element here. And inside is where I'm actually going to create my card component. So let's say my card is going to have, we know it's going to have at least a title, and it's going to also have some description. It's going to have the message we actually entered for that note. So inside of this div, let's say we have a title. I'll make this an H2, and I'm not filling anything in yet. And maybe I want a divider to separate out the title and the description. And then for the description, I'll have just a paragraph tag. Now we need to give the template and all these elements some identifiers so that we can actually use them from within our JavaScript code. So I'm going to go ahead and give the template an ID, since it just has the template is just found once. So I think this is an okay place to use an ID, since IDs can only ever be used once anyway. So let's say I'm going to say this is a note template. And inside of my div here, I'll give this a class. And this is going to be my note. And then inside of here, now for any of you that are not familiar, I like to use the BEM methodology, I suppose, the way of organizing my code. So in this case, my note is my block. Now I will create an element. And that element is probably going to be called, let's say, note title. Then for this divider, maybe we don't need a class yet. We'll figure that out, but definitely I might want a class for this note message, let's say. So you can see here we have my block. It belongs to the note, and then my element, so BEM, block element modifier, belongs to the note, and this is an element, which is our title. So just starting to get everything there. I'll jump into the file structure once again to CSS because that is really where it starts making more sense. But now this is really cool because we have this template we can just pull from, and instead of creating all these different things, instead of saying, for example, document.createElement, div, create element h2, create element hr, create element p, append all these to div, and then append all the divs to the section. We already have a template that now we can just fill in the blanks, right? So we really just need our text content to be filled in here, and we can figure that out on JavaScript. So I think this will be a good place for us to pretty much end, but I do still want to see something on the screen. So in the meantime, while we're doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out. We'll actually copy the actual content of the template, and we'll just go ahead and create our first note and what that's going to look like. You can imagine that when we first start on our page, there isn't going to be actually anything in this section. This is where our templates will come in, and the JavaScript will fill that stuff in for us. So let's come in here, and let's see. I'm going to say my first note. Say this is the message of my first note. Woohoo. Very cool. So now let's go ahead and jump to the browser. Let's open the browser here. And now you can see we have the title, note taker. It says my first note. We have our nice divider to separate out the title and the description. And it says this is the message of my first note. Woohoo. So that's pretty great. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code now. And let me just go ahead and create another one and see how that looks. So we're going to say here my second note. I'll say things are starting to get real fun over here. Let's save that. Let's go back to our browser. And now we can see my first note and my second note. Now, of course, I don't really care for these to be the entire width of the page, but we'll go ahead and figure all that stuff out once we get the CSS all ironed out. So I believe that this is a good starting point for us. What have we figured out so far in here? Well, we figured out a very basic HTML structure for our application, and we have this template that we'll be using once we get into the JavaScript, and now we already know what things can start looking like. So we can start filling in the blanks in our JavaScript, and we'll be appending all these different things to our grid once we start dynamically entering that information. So I will see you all in the CSS section. But actually, before I get there, let me do a very important thing. Now that we have Git installed here, if we do a git status, you can see that now we have this untracked file, which is our index.html. I want to go ahead and add that to my staging area. If we do a git status again, you can see that now it's staged, it's ready to be committed. So let's go ahead and commit that because we've ended off in a good place. It's a small and complete commit that we know we can always revert back to. So we'll say initial HTML skeleton. Let's do that. And now if we do a git log, we can see our commit right here, initial HTML skeleton, with the commit hash that we can always revert back to if need be. So that about wraps up the HTML section, and I will see you all for the CSS. Okay, so back in our app over here, you see this is where we left off before with our simple HTML. Now let's get to some of the fun stuff, and let's start styling a little bit of this just to make it a little bit more presentable. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my dev tools here. The way that I'm doing that on my keyboard is just typing in F12. But if you're on a Chromium-based browser like Chrome, I'm using Microsoft Edge. You can actually access the developer tools by Oh, I'm actually looking at my recording, and for some reason it's not showing the drop-down menu when I click this, but if you click the three dots up here and you'll scroll down to that drop-down, you'll see it says More Tools, and in there you can also do Developer Tools, and you'll be able to see the Developer Tools from there. So let's just start hovering over some of these things and see what I'd like to do. So I definitely want this to be centered. So the reason I'm doing this all through DevTools right now is because it makes it I can quickly prototype something without having to hard code it or put it in Visual Studio Code yet. Once I have a nice design that I like, I'll go ahead and actually commit that. I want my notes to be a grid, so let's make this type of grid. And for the grid, I want the rows, I want there to be an automatic amount of rows, and then for my columns, I want there to be 3. So I'm going to say I want 3 columns all at the 1 fractional unit. It makes the spacing really nice. It already handles a lot of the issues that come with responsiveness. So this fractional unit is very nice. By the way, this grid right here, if we actually expand this, you can see that it's a shorthand for a lot of these other properties that are here. So the auto stands for the grid template rows. And for our columns, we're using this repeat 3 1FR. So we can actually write these individually, but I prefer the shorthand. I think it just makes things a little more concise, easier to read, so on and so forth. Then for my gap, I think I'll give it a 1 rem, which should equate to about 16 pixels. So that's looking good so far. And then as far as each one of my notes, let's say that I want to give them all a border of 1 pixel solid purple. I like purple, so that's pretty nice. And then I'll give it a padding maybe of 1 rem. So I think right now this is a good place for us to start. So let's see how we can actually figure this thing out from our code. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to start doing now is I'm going to start creating different classes for all these different sections, and then we'll go from there. Now, one thing I noticed about my HTML is just to use more semantic elements, I'm going to go ahead and instead of calling this H1, I'm going to call this a header, since that is really what it is. And then we have our section here, and that's all good and dandy. So let's go ahead and give this a class simply of header. Let's give this a class of notes, since that's really what it is. And I think we can go ahead and start there. So let me show you all how I'm going to structure this. So in BEM, we normally would have a blocks folder where each one of our different blocks corresponds to the blocks that we've already created in our HTML. For example, header, notes, and note. These are all different blocks. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead in here and create, just to start off, I'll create 3 different folders for 3 different blocks. So I'll create my header block, I will create my notes block, and I'll also create my note block. Now inside of each one of these, I'll have a corresponding CSS file. So I'll have header.css, I'll have note.css, and I'll also do notes.css. Very, very cool. Now, how do we actually connect this to our CSS, rather our HTML? We also get this pages folder. Now, pages corresponds to the different pages on your website, the different HTML. Right now, we only have one single page, which is index.html. So for my single page, I will call it index.css. The pages in this case correspond to the CSS that is related to the page we're on. You can imagine if we had an about.html page or a contact.html page, we might also have a corresponding about.css page and a contact.css page. We're going to stick with the index.css for now. And what this page is responsible for is simply importing all the CSS rules we've already defined in our block section. And I normally like to keep things alphabetized. Now, depending on the cascade rule of CSS, you sometimes might need to put the order differently, but we'll start off alphabetized and then we'll mess around with it if need be. So I'm going to use this @import rule here, and then we can simply look for each one of our CSS files and import them that way. So we'll go ahead and do that now. We have note.css, import URL, blocks, notes, notes.css. Now the really nice thing is that from our index.html file, now the only thing we need to do, instead of importing multiple CSS files, is we just need to say, all I want is the pages index.css file, and we're good to go from there. Now, on top of this, I'm probably going to want to use some fonts from Google, for example. So let's say Google is a third-party vendor. So we'll also create a folder here called vendor. And inside of here, I'll have a folder called fonts.css. And in my pages file, the first thing I want to load up is my fonts. So I'll actually go ahead and use that here. So we have vendor fonts.css. And let's go ahead and take care of that Google Fonts styling right now. So I'm going to go to Google Fonts. I'm gonna find myself a font that I like a lot. I don't know, I've found some fonts that I actually don't pick from the most popular ones. Like Roboto is very nice. A lot of these are very nice, but let's pick one I haven't used in a while. Like, I don't know, Montserrat I really do like a lot. So maybe I'll go with Montserrat. Noto Sans JP is also nice too. Let's see what Montserrat has. I'll pick some of the different ones here. Like we can pick 400 and 700 are normally pretty good. So let's start with those two. Google Fonts is nice because it also gives you the import right here. So we can actually just take this import, oh, and go back to our Visual Studio Code. Inside of our font CSS, we'll use the same @import rule we have already used in our pages. And now whenever we import that, we're also importing this Google Fonts reference. And back in our browser, we'll actually copy this font family rule, come back to our Visual Studio Code. And what I'd like to do is instead of just targeting the body in CSS, I'm going to go ahead and make another class for this, and I'll simply call it body. I'll come inside blocks, create a body block, body.css, And then I'll target that rule and set a font family of Montserrat and then the backup of sans serif. And of course, inside of our index CSS, we'll have to also include that new block. All right, cool. So let's see how things are now looking back in browser land. Go back to browser land, we can see that now it's looking a little more presentable. The fonts are definitely helping us out a lot here. It looks a lot neater. And if we actually hover over one of these, we can see that if we go to the computed tab here and scroll all the way down, we can see that the rendered font is actually the Montserrat font that we have imported from Google Fonts. So that is pretty cool. Now let's go ahead and apply those CSS rules that we've already messed with in the browser. Let's go back to our CSS. Let's go ahead and get started here. So we know that for our header, we wanted to set the alignment to center. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do a text align center. Back in our HTML, we know that for our notes block, we were going to set a display of grid. That grid was going to have an automatic amount of columns, and then we were going to, for 3 times, repeat the columns. It was going to have an automatic amount of rows and then 3 different columns. And then for our gap, we were going to make it 1 rem. And then for our individual notes, I believe we had settled on a 1 pixel solid purple border with a padding of 1 rem. So let's go ahead and see how that looks now back in our browser. Look at that, exactly how we set it off. So far, so good. Things are looking pretty nice. And let's keep messing around with the CSS here a little bit. So let me see. This is actually not even getting that small. That's pretty nice. It doesn't really shrink down that much, which is nice. Let's maybe give our header here some margin so that things aren't too close to there. And I'll probably increase the font size and maybe make that a bold. So let's see our header here, note taker. Oh, I see what happened. So this is our header, but we haven't actually specified an H1 through H6 rule. So let's go ahead and do that in our Visual Studio Code. Back inside of our HTML here, I'm going to just make a nice space there. I'll set the H1, put this here. And now let's say here we'll have a class for header, let's say header title. Now, because now we have this element inside of header, how do we accommodate that in our BEM? Well, inside of our blocks here, let me actually condense this part. Inside of our header, we'll create another folder that's just the name of the block. You can see how we still have the double underscore there. Inside of here, we'll actually call this header.title underscore title.css. And you guessed it, inside of here, now we can do something like, I don't know, font weight. We want it to be the 700 that we had. All good and dandy. Maybe under the header CSS, let's give this a margin bottom of also 1 rem just to keep everything uniform. Now, inside of header.css, we can easily import the header title to pages, but really header title is owned by header CSS. So why don't we just let the header CSS file decide what it needs to import and how it needs to use it. So now header imports its own title since it owns it, and that's a good way for us to move forward to keep everything sort of together. Now, if we go back to our browser, you see that now we have this nice margin, a little bit more of a font weight here. Things are looking pretty nice. But if I actually, let me go back to that H1 here. I may not even need that font weight. It might already be decided by the H1 tag. Maybe I didn't actually put a font. Oh, here we go. Yeah, the font weight isn't actually needed. It's already decided by the user agent style sheet, which is bold, and I believe 700 actually ends up being bold. So in that case, why don't we go ahead and just remove that header title? Even though we just added all this, maybe we don't actually need it, and that's fine. That's the iterative process of development here that we're experimenting with. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the title from here, remove the import, save all that. Let's go back to our browser and we can see that things are exactly as we left it. Now, if we go to the console up here, well, there was an error because when I was actually messing with my imports, the page refreshed before I was able to remove any references to that now deleted file. So I think this is a great place for us to start. I think one thing that I would like to do, we need a way to delete one of these notes, right? So let us think about what we can do here. I definitely want a button to say delete. So let's see what we can do with that. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code here. And maybe for now, I'll create a simple button. So let's see how that works. Let's say button here, and let's say delete note. Let's go back to our browser. All right, delete note. So let's just start with that simple button there. I'm also going to style this because I believe that the font is not the same. If we go to the computed styles here and we look at the font family, yeah, we can see it's actually Arial. It's not actually using the Montserrat family that we have. So let me go ahead and change that. Of course, I will create a new class for this. Let's say this is just note delete. We'll come inside of note here. Oh, well, look at this. We don't actually have any rules right now for note title, note message, note delete, but we will create one for delete. Inside of delete, we'll have note delete, and then in here, note delete. I'm going to go ahead and copy the same font family from the body, copy that there, and then again, because note delete is owned by the notes, we will just go ahead and import it in the file itself. Let's go back to browser land. And look at that. Now we have this nice font here. Things are looking nice. Maybe I'll go ahead and give this a cursor of pointer just so things look a little bit better there. Come back to VS Code. Let's say that for note delete, we want this to be a type of cursor pointer. Come back to browser. Now we have the nice cursor pointer when we hover over that. Now, as you can see, I think this is great CSS for the purpose of this application. A lot of the CSS you see us working on here is to make things presentable, but really the point of these videos is to focus more on the JavaScript, the more low level, I suppose, raw JavaScript, getting used to how the logic works and figuring out how to make things work well. But I still want to make something, again, a little bit presentable so we're not just really looking at plain Jane HTML and no anything else that's fun. Like I've said before, if you want me to dig deeper into CSS, if you really want to make this a fully fledged, CSS awesome looking note-taking app, I can surely help us all do that. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. But for the meantime, like I said, I think this serves our purposes well for now. We have a nice grid coming along here. We have our header. And actually, before I move on, what if we were to add a couple more notes? Let's see how our page renders just based on that. So let's come back to Visual Studio Code. I'm actually just going to copy these two and paste them. Let's come back to browser land. And now this is looking great. Let's see, we can reduce this. It doesn't really get that skinny, which is nice. I think it's still readable, so that's very cool. And there you go. We have a nice gap in between all these nodes. We have access to all the different nodes. And now later on, we'll start focusing on how we can actually remove all these different nodes and focus on the JavaScript, which is going to be the next thing and the most fun part of the application. So I hope to see you all there in a few. Of course, before we move on to the JavaScript section, something that I almost forgot is remember that we have worked a lot right now. We've added a lot of new functionality to our application via all the different file structure and BEM rules and so on and so forth. If we do a git status now, we have a ton of things to add. So let's go ahead and do that now and make sure that we're committing so that we are in a good spot. I'll say here, I'll call this initial CSS and BEM file structure. I'll commit this. Now if we go back to git status, we have nothing to commit. Let's clear that. And if we go to our log, we see that we now have two different commits that we can revert back to. It's nice to keep things organized. We have ways to revert. Things are looking great right now. So let's go ahead and get to the fun JavaScript. Okay, let's remind ourselves of where we left off with the CSS. We have now, well, rather, and HTML. We have our title, we have our different notes, we have these delete note buttons. Now we're going to get to the really, really fun stuff, and that's, of course, the JavaScript. Now, what I'm going to do for this section is I'm going to create smaller sections just comprising of focused work, and we'll be creating a lot more commits during this section instead of before in HTML and CSS. We just pretty much created the final commit. So, of course, the most important thing that I forgot here was to, of course, create the form that a user will need to use to be able to go ahead and enter in a message and a title of the note that they're creating. So let's go ahead and take care of that now before moving forward. So back in Visual Studio Code, for now, I think what I'm going to do is maybe inside of our header, let's say we have some different sections here, right? We have our section here for notes and we have our section for our form. Let's go ahead and create a form here like we have in the past. Nothing crazy. Let's say we have two different fields. I'm going to say our, of course, our title field and our different, we'll also have our message field. So maybe I want a text area instead, but let's figure it out. So here we have, I'm going to create two different divs here. And then finally, I'll create a button, and this one I'll make it of type submit, and I'll say create note. Back in here, let's say I'll create a label, and I'll create an input of type text. This one's going to be for our note title. Let's give this an ID of note. Oh, let's just say title. Say this for title. We'll also give it a name of title, so that way we can easily access it in our JavaScript. And I'll also say that this is required. I do want some basic client-side validation here. And then inside of our label here, we'll do the same thing, but this is going to be for our message. I'll say this is our note message. I'll come back in here and I'll do a text area. I'll call this one message. I'll give this an ID of message. Let's stick with the normal col and row here. And let's remove this. And let's go ahead and see how this looks now. So let's go back to our browser. We can see that things are looking a little bit crazy, but we'll go ahead and figure that out in no time. So I'm going to open my DevTools here and see what sort of styling we can accomplish. So inside of our section here, let's see, we have our note message and text area. I think I'd probably like to make each one of these. Yeah, I think it might be nicer to make them maybe block level elements for these labels, just so things sit below. So let's see for this next div here. I'll also make this a display of block. I think it's just a little bit clearer. And then for the section itself, let's see what we can do in here. If I make this whole thing, let's mess around with this. Let's make it a flex box. Then let's also give it a flex direction of column. And then let's think about this for each one of my different. What if I were to align my items centered? So I think this could be this is actually, I think, a good place for us to start. Again, maybe not the prettiest thing, but it gets the job done and it allows us to quickly continue forward with our application. So let us now start creating the CSS necessary for what we've done here. And let's just make sure that we remember everything, right? So we have display flex, line item center, different labels going to be display blocks. So we only need to create the CSS blocks for what we've actually changed. And then maybe for this section, also given a bottom margin of 1 rem, so it just sticks a little bit nicer between these different sections here. Okay, so let's go ahead and focus on that. So back in Visual Studio Code land, let me just remove the bottom here, get some more real estate for us. And let's give this section here a class of, maybe form is not the best, let's say note. Maybe note is not the best. Let's think. I could just simply call it a note form. Doesn't really, it's not my favorite thing, but I think the form might be, it's the easiest name to remember. So we know that we gave our section the class of form, and then the inside of the form we did have that display flex to keep everything aligned. So let's start messing around with that and see what we can get. So inside of blocks, we'll create a new form block. Here we'll create our form.css, and then let's start writing that out. So I believe we had display of flex, we had our align items centered, we had our flex direction set to column, and then of course that margin bottom of 1 rem. Inside of our pages now, we'll have to include that, and that's going to come right after our B here, again, just to keep things alphabetized like I like to. Let's go back to browser land and see how that's looking so far. Okay, cool. So we have it centered now. And now on our labels, we need to give it that display of blocks so things sit nicely underneath each other. Let's go ahead and figure that out. Back in Visual Studio Code land, go to index.html. Now here, maybe we can say that this is just, well, it's a form label, right? So let's say form label. And then here again, form label. Let's come inside of here. We'll create a new subfolder and we'll call it label. We'll call this form underscore label.css. And of course, we'll now give it the display of block like we had before. Form label is indeed owned by our form. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back to browser land. And look at that. So we're right back to where we left off. We have the nice margin. We have a form so that we can actually take care of actually inputting the information we'll need on our forms here on our different notes. And we can go ahead and continue. So I'm going to go ahead and create a commit based on the work that we've done here. So again, let's go back to Visual Studio. You can see that I've done a git status. We have block form. Let's add this and let's commit and we say added note form. Perfect. So now we have a good stopping point there. Now let's go ahead and continue beginning to connect some of the JavaScript so we can start getting some of that functionality that we like. All right, so this next part is going to be a lot of fun. I figured out a nice way to sort of organize our JavaScript and start using some of these classes that you may have seen with JavaScript. Classes help us really sort of encapsulate some of this logic that we need, helps us really organize our code, and on top of this, we'll be using modules so that things, again, are just neatly separated. We don't have a massive file containing all of this business logic. Again, it makes it a lot easier for us to maintain, debug, share with other developers, so on and so forth. So I'm really excited for this section. And let's go ahead and go step by step on how we are going to formulate this application. So I'm going to create a new folder called scripts. Inside of scripts, I'm going to create an index.js file, and I'm also going to create a note.js file. Now, inside of note.js, this is where we're going to have the logic for our notes. And inside of index.js, we might have the logic to append things to our grid, remove things from our grid, so on and so forth. But I really want to keep all the note-specific application inside of Note, and we'll see how we can do that in a second. Now, to connect all this, and to be able to use import and export, we're going to need to include our script, like always. You can see that me, just by typing script, I get that Emmet abbreviation for source. I'm going to go ahead and import, well rather include my index.js, but I'm going to make this a type of module. This way we can import things into it. Okay, so let's come over here to Node.js and let's see what we're going to do from here. I'm going to very simply start off with a class that's called Note. Now, what is this Note class going to contain? Well, it's going to have a constructor since we're going to need a new way to create a note. And that node constructor will contain a title and a message. Now we want to bind these to private properties inside of our class. Now, private properties by default, JavaScript doesn't know that things are private. There is some new syntax that's not readily available in all browsers yet that will truly allow us to make private variables. But in the meantime, and it's sort of convention to denote private properties with an underscore before the identifier. What does that mean? Well, I want to create two new private properties called title, and now I can bind these properties that I've passed in to these private properties. Okay, all good so far. Things are looking nice. So how do we actually now start connecting this to our JavaScript? Well, very, very simple, right? We now have this constructor that allows us to essentially pass in this data. Now we need a way to say, well, I have this note. How can I actually connect it to, well, the template that we had already created previously? Well, very, very simply. Inside of Note.js, we can now create a new private class since we only, not a private class, a private method that only needs to be available in here. This is now going to say get template for the note. So let's go ahead and create a new variable here and call it note template. And now we can start saying, okay, document query selector. We want to query for our note template, which we know we've called note template. And actually, maybe just to follow the BEM rules, I'll call it note template just like this. I'm going to give it the pound. From this, we want to get the content of that template. And now we're going to query selector again, and this time we'll go ahead and get the note. And then finally, we're going to clone this node so that every time we call this function, we get a brand new template, which we can then fill things in. And here we'll say return note template. So now we have a way to not only pass in information here, we can also get a template that we can use later on. Now I want to export this note so that we can use it inside of our index.js file. So back in index.js land, we can go ahead and now do import note from note.js. We actually need the extension so that it familiarizes ourselves with this being a module. Now, because we're using modules, we need to make sure that we're actually running this on a development server. That's the only way that modules will work. But in the meantime, let's go back to browser land and let's see if things are working okay. You can imagine we haven't actually changed anything, but what we've done is now, if we go to our head here, you can see that we're actually importing that index.js file. It's a module, and we have no errors, which is a good place for us to now stop and then continue forward. So I just want to show you how we've started structuring our app. Right now, we have our index.html file that's importing this index.js module. Inside of that module, we're importing our note class that we will use to begin creating notes, adding event listeners to these notes, and adding the title and message to the actual template so it can be rendered onto the screen. Let's go ahead and see how to do that in 1 second. Okay, back in HTML land, we no longer want to have these notes here anymore. This is now going to be completely controlled through JavaScript and no longer through our HTML. So I'm going to delete all the different notes we have here. And just to make things very concise, I'm just going to put this all in one line. I will now uncomment my template. So now when the page is rendered, it actually familiarizes itself with the template. It won't render anything onto the screen, but it'll be aware of that template. Okay, cool. Let's go back to our note.js file now, and let's see how it is that we can actually pass, or rather using the information that we've given, let's see how we can now use it ourselves. I'm going to create a public method now on top of the private ones, because most of the time developers are interested in the public API. Private methods just sort of stick to the bottom, since we don't really need to know about them in order to use the note class. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, well, I want to generate a note. So what am I going to do? Now I can say, well, I want this note, again, a private property of the class, since we don't need to expose that anywhere. I'm going to set it equal to this.getTemplate. So now this note contains the template that we've returned from this getTemplate function. Now we know that in our template, we have two different spots where we want to enter information, note title and note message. So let's go ahead and query for that information. Now we can say that this underscore note dot query selector. Now we can say note title. The text content of that is equal to, well, it's equal to the title that we originally passed in to this class. Similarly, we can say that query selector note underscore message, and I missed the class selector here. The text content of that is equal to, I'm sure you've guessed it, this dot message. Now we can actually return this dot note. So now when we call generate note, it will add to the title and the message, to its text content, the title and message that we've passed into the constructor. Sounds great. How can we actually use it? Let's go now to index.js and let's start using some of this imports that we've created. We're going to need a place to actually get our notes. So let's say here we have const notes wrapper. I'm going to set this equal to document query selector notes. All right, cool. Now let's create a new note. This is my favorite part. We're going to say and come here and say const note equals new note. And now when we actually open up these parentheses, you say, okay, title and message. It knows what it is expecting. Let's go ahead and say first note, very bland here, first note message. Very, very cool. Now, notes wrapper, we want to append the note that we've just created. Notes, look at this. We actually have a generate note method. That generate note method, if we come back, actually takes in, gets the template, sets the title and message equal to the text content of the constituent parts, and it returns that note. And we can actually use that to append it to our notes. Let's save this, and now let's go back to browser land and look at that. Now, using classes, we've been able to create our note, and everything is so neatly organized. We have a class that strictly handles logic about the note, and now we can start creating new notes all based off that blueprint, that factory that we've created. So very cool stuff happening here. I'm very excited to continue along with this. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, so stick around. The next thing we're going to do is let's see if we can actually get the user input and go ahead and dynamically create these notes instead of manually doing it like we just did. All right, before we continue, I of course want to commit what we've gotten so far since we've done a lot of progress here. Let's go ahead and add all our new files and let's commit it. And let's say creation of notes class and beginning to add notes to page. Great. Let's continue forward now with seeing how we can get the information from our note form and actually use that information to create a new card dynamically. Okay, cool. So let's go back to our index.html and now let's see what we got here. Well, I want to get access to this form here, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to give this a name of form, simply just that. I'm going to go back to index.js here, and now let's see if we can get access to that form. So I'm going to go ahead and say const note form equals document.forms. We should just be able to pass in the name of the form here. Okay, and now on that form, I want to add an event listener. Add event listener. I want to add it for the submit event. And inside of here, I want to say that I want to prevent the default. I don't want it to actually submit when I click on that submit button. So let's say prevent default. Now, really quick, I'm going to comment this out. Let's see if we can actually debug this and see if everything worked out so far. So back in browser world, of course, we have no notes because we haven't created any new notes. But let's go ahead and come to our sources. Let's come to our scripts. Node.js. Let me condense this. Actually, not Node.js, index.js. And let's refresh this page. Note form. Okay, looks like we're actually getting a reference to the form. Very cool. Let's see now if I create this, please fill out the field. All good there. Hello, hello. Create note. Okay, so it looks like we're able to click this. The event's not sent, so I imagine this part is working. It sure is. Very, very cool. All right. I just also realized that the font family for the input here, and I'm not even sure, is it the same here? Can we check the font family here? See, font family is monospace. I want to make both of those and the create note. I want to give all that the same Montserrat class that we had before. They're all Arial. Let's go ahead and tackle that really quickly. Something that is simple. So we saw that the input, the label, and the button, not the label, I'm sorry, both the input and the text area and the button all needed to get that font family. So, of course, we're going to create new classes for this. I'm going to go ahead and call this form input. Of course, I need to go back to my code here. We have the input, the text here, and the button that we all need to change. Here, I'll give this a class of form text area. And then here, I'll give this a class of form button. Very, very simple. Now, since this is getting a little bit crazy, a lot of different attributes, I normally like to split these up in between different lines. This is really just a preference, but I think it just makes it a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to read. I'm going to do the same thing for the text area here. The label is okay as it doesn't span too many columns. I forgot that I also want to make this required. Let's go ahead and do that. And for the button, we can leave that alone. Now let's go back to our blocks here, and this is all going to go under form. We already have our form label. Now we're going to need to create form input. Form input.css. Let me go back to the body and get the font family that we need for this. So say form input is going to be that. Back in HTML, we need our text area. So let's do text area here. Form text area.css. Form text area. Same font family. And then finally for our button, form button.css. Form button font family. And then of course inside of form, we know what it owns. So again, let's say here, we're going to have at import URL button. We have our input next. And then finally, we have our text area. Things we're already used to. Let's come back to browser land. And now let's see. Font family in here is nice. Font family in here is nice. And our create note is also good. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and see how we can get the data from the form into our code. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code land. Let's remove all this, make it a little easier to read. Let's go to index.js, and now let's figure out how to get the information. Now, if I remember correctly, there should be an elements attribute that exists on this. Let's see if that works. So we're going to prevent the default. Now we want to go ahead and get our title. Let's say that's going to be equal to noteform.elements. I'll say this is title, just to make sure. I gave this a name of title and a name of message, I believe. Perfect. Say const, and then let's say const message equals note form dot elements message. Now, just for fun, let's go ahead and console log these title and message. Perfect. And let's see what that actually does now back in browser land. Okay, let me refresh here. Let me go to the console and clear all this out. I'm going to say first note, create note. Okay, so we did get the elements, but we need to actually get the value from each one of them. So let's come here and say dot value, and also notice in here for my input, I want autocomplete to be off. I believe that's the right value. Come back to browser land. I don't want this to complete for me because we don't really know. I mean, it could be anything, right? So let's say first note, or rather first message. Awesome. First note, first message. Now we have it. So let's go ahead and start appending some things to here. Go back to our code. We've already realized how to append things. So let me come here and copy the notes wrapper. Normally I like to keep things a little bit. For example, I might have a section just for wrappers. I might have a section for, let's say, form elements. So let's see. Now we know how to do this. So let's say const note equals new note. Now inside of here, we'll pass the title and the message. And then we can say notes wrapper dot append note dot generate note. There you go. So let's now remove all this code here. Let's come back to our browser and let's see what we can do. So let's say first note. I am so excited for this. Would you look at that? And let's see what happens if we do another one. First note, first note, first note, first note. We can keep creating and creating. We can scroll down and look at all those notes that we have created. Very, very cool. Something else that I want to is I don't think we should really be so aggressive on the spell check here. So let's see if we can remove some of these because we don't know what people are going to enter. And this is really just for fun. Don't think that spell check is necessary. So I think there's a way to turn it off here. So let's see if here spell check false. Let's see what this does. Let's go back to our browser. Let's type random things. Okay, looks like we are good there. If I want to create a note with that information, I certainly can. Okay, I think this is a great place for us. So now let's finally get back to our application here and let's see what we can do. It says user can create a note, user can edit a note, user can delete a note, and when closing the browser window, the notes will be stored, and when the user returns, the data will be retrieved. Okay, cool. So I want to now focus on this next part, which is user can edit a note and user can also delete a note. Let's focus on that now in the next video. Before we continue, of course, let's make sure that we committed what we have added. Let's go ahead and add all this to our staging area. And let's say refactoring and adding dynamic notes. Perfect. See you in a bit. Okay, let's focus now on deleting a note from our list of already written notes. So two things I want to do here. The first thing, and that's sort of just a quality of life improvement, if we go back to our browser now, you can see that when I create a new note, so new note, enter anything here, and I click create, the previous data for that node is still in the input, it's still part of our form, I actually want to reset that information. So let's go back to our Visual Studio Code. Now inside of index.js, where I have the notes here, not only do I want to prevent the default, but once I actually append this, what if we were just to do note form dot reset to reset the field values. So let's go now back to browser land and let's say new note, some information, create notes. That's great. So now if we create another one by accident, it will actually again validate it. Whereas before we can keep creating new notes and it won't actually be validated, so it doesn't lend itself well to a good user experience. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue moving on here. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code land and let's figure out how we can start adding the remove functionality. Okay, so we know that inside of our Node.js, we want for this to handle the remove itself. So let's go ahead and create a new private field. It's not something that needs to be handled publicly. And let's say here, handle delete. We know that when I do this, I want to call this dot note, and I can call the method remove. And let's revisit that really quick, and let's see what that is. So let's do mdn remove. MDN for Mozilla Developer Network remove, and it's exactly what we need, right? It says the child node remove method removes the object from the tree that it belongs to. If we go back to our code here, we know that these nodes belong to the tree of notes that we have here. So when we click on remove, we want to remove that note from the notes tree. Okay, great. Now, when I'm creating all these different event listeners, I want to have one method that sort of sets all of them up. So I'm going to create another private field here, another private method, and say set event listeners. And I'll actually go ahead and call this during the time that we're generating our note. So I'll say set event listeners here. And maybe we'll actually have this after. I feel like all this stuff is note related, so I can actually put all that together and then say set event listeners here. Now inside of here, what I want to do, well, I have my delete button. Actually, no, I don't. I hadn't included that. Even though we actually have a class for it here, it's inside of note delete. Let's create that real quick. So I'm going to say this is a button with class of note delete. We'll say here delete note. So inside of here, I want to say, well, this note query selector for note delete. I want to say add event listener for click. And inside of there, when we click that, I want to call this handle delete. So what have we done? We have our set event listeners method. We know that we now have an event listener on the note delete for click that will handle delete. The handle to delete will remove the note from the parent tree that it belongs to. And we also set those event listeners at the moment that we're generating the note. So let's go back to browser land and let's see how all that stuff turned out. Make sure we have no errors in the console, so things are looking pretty good. Let's create our first note, first message. We create note. Now we see we have that button, and when we click on delete note, we also go ahead and delete the note. And we can see that now we have no console errors. So very, very cool stuff. Let's again say first note, first message, say create note, say second note, second message, create note, and if we want to delete them, we can go ahead and do so just like that. And again, no console errors. Things are looking great. Again, we have everything organized in this class. It manages all its logic on its own. So let's move on forward to now being able to go ahead and edit a note, but not before, of course, we commit what we have done. So again, committing here, let's say added delete notes functionality. Perfect. All right, see you all in the edit note section. Hope you're all ready for this next session. It's definitely going to be the beefiest and I think most interesting section, and I'm even going to be able to use some new attributes I have not used before. So let's go through this one by one, be very meticulous in how we're going to do this and really think about it. We want to be able to edit our notes. Luckily for us, there already exists a method that I was looking up earlier. It's called content editable. It says the content editable property of the HTML element interface specifies whether or not the element is editable. This enumerator attribute can have the following values. And look at this. There's an example they give down here. Well, I thought so. I could have sworn I saw it earlier. Yeah, look at this. So they have uneditable paragraphs, and this one's editable. I mean, you can change it right here. And this actually modifies the text content of the element itself. So it seems like this is something very good for us to use. So now let's go back to our code and let's see how we can make this happen. Well, I know I'm going to need to introduce a new button here. I'm going to go ahead and call this edit. So I'll say this is note edit. I'm also going to have a save button too. Now, for now, the save button will always show up, but it probably shouldn't really show up during the time that we're in edit mode. But for the purposes of the application, let's leave it like this for now, and maybe we'll revisit this in the bonus section to see how we can make this a little better. I'll also change the class here, and of course, we'll need to have separate elements for all these different things. So even though they're all going to be the same, so note edit and note save. So let's just come to delete. Let's copy note delete. Inside of here, we'll have note edit. We'll change this to note edit. Inside of save, we'll call this note save.css. Note save, same thing. Oh, note save. And then of course in note CSS, we will now have our different imports. Since notes own those, we'll put it right inside of the note file. Okay, something else I want to do is so these things don't sit right next to each other. I'm going to make the, let's see, the first one we have is delete. Let's make this a block level element. And let's also make the edit a block level element so things just sit a little bit more nice. Okay, let's go back to browser land and see how this is looking. So I'm just going to type anything here. That's fine. Okay, now we have delete note, edit note. Might want to give some margin to edit and save note. So let's go ahead and do that in VS Code land. Actually, you know, it would probably be nicer if we can space it out evenly. I'm going to actually give that a shot here. Let's go in here and let's call this note buttons. Let's cut this out. Let's put it in here. If we go back to the browser now, everything should still look the same. Okay. But now instead of going into Visual Studio, let's just mess with this a little bit. What if I gave this a display of flex? And then let's say, oh, the thing is it's flushed with the different ones here. So what if we gave these some flex basis? Or is there a way for us to make it? Although this is okay. It's not really my favorite way of doing it, but oh, we accidentally deleted that. That might be a nicer way of doing it. Let me again just go to, oh, that's my notes. I don't want that. I want to go right back to here. Let's say just flex here. What if I said here for this flex basis? Well, even if I gave this, we can say flex row. They'll all go at the same. Yeah, I suppose this is a better way now. At least things are a little more nicely lined up. So let's go ahead and stick with this. Let's go back to VS Code. Let's create a new class now for note buttons under note buttons. Let's call this note buttons.css. We're going to say that's display flex, not flow root, display flex. Now because of that, we can go to all these different ones like delete, not going to need display block anymore, and edit is also not going to need display block, and save will be fine. So now let's go back to our browser. Looks like we may have missed something. Oh, okay, I know what happened. We forgot to also import the note buttons into note. So let's come up here, import URL, buttons, go back to browser land, remove this for now. Let's refresh. All right, great. So things are looking a little bit nicer here. Everything is sort of a little bit cleaner, so that's cool. Okay, let's go back to Visual Studio Code now, and let's focus on this next fun part. So I'm going to delete all these different, not delete them, but just remove them. Now let's focus on note.js. Well, let us think about this. We are going to need a new way to handle an edit. So let's say here, handle edits. And we know that will happen when we click on the note edit button. So let's come over here, make this handle edit, and this will be handle edit. What is that we want to do? We want to set the attribute of content editable true to both the note title and the note message. Now, what can we do here? Generate note. We're going to get access to each one of these. So, okay, let's go ahead and do that. So let's come over here. Let's copy this, handle edit. Let us go ahead and change these. I believe it's content editable to true. That will happen when we do handle edit. So let's go and see what happens now when we do that. Let's go back to browser land. Just enter some stuff here. Right now, if I click this, nothing happens. If I click on edit note, look at that. I can actually click on this and change the way it looks. Okay, very cool. Now let's focus on this save note. Let's go back to Visual Studio. Let's create another method here called handle save. Let's come down here. Oh, I'll just copy this one actually. Note save, handle save, and inside of here, let us do handle save. Let's do the same thing. We're just gonna really set this now equal to false. So I'm already seeing that there's some duplication here. There is something that we can do to make this better. I think instead of doing that, we can just say handle edit on both. But when we're saving, we're handling the edit and we're setting it equal to false for both cases here. So let's say, what's something that's more generic? Handle edit, handle edit. What if we were to say handle edit toggle? For example, well, let's just keep it at handle edit and we can pass in a property here called editable. Where here we set this to editable. Let's remove the handle save here. And then in handle edit on this one, we can pass true. And then on handle edit here, we can pass false. Let's go back to browser land and see what that does for us. Let's check the console real quick. No console errors. That's nice. Let's say first note, first message, create the note. Currently cannot do anything. What happens if I click save note first? If I click save note, still nothing. If I click edit note, I can say first edited note, first edited message. If I click edit note again, what's going to happen? Still true. Now, if I say save note, you can see that we can no longer edit this. And if I come to edit note, we can continue editing here. Save note can no longer edit. Now, what happens if I actually just delete this? Is it going to be easy for us to see? It's a little bit harder now for me to click on these different fields, but if I click edit note, it looks like it actually comes back. So first note, first message, save note, perfect, and we can still go ahead and delete it. No console errors. Very, very neat. Now we have figured out how to edit our different notes. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code land here. Let's think about what we've added. So now we have this handle edit, which takes a parameter editable, which will set the property of the content editable attribute on both the note title and note message nodes to the value of editable. So now whenever we do an edit or a save, we pass in the corresponding Boolean value of each one of those. And now while we're here, something I just want to add, I like adding comments where necessary just to describe a little bit about what each one of these different pieces are doing. So I'll say this is a note class to manage business logic of a note. So say generate note. So returns an instance of a note. Here we say method used to generate a new note and add the corresponding title and message properties to their respective fields. Queries. See, this will send us a, here this is nice because we can actually, we know what clone note gives us, and if we want to be very, very specific here, which I would actually like to, let's see, let's look up clone node, right? Actually, we can even do one better here. We can come to our browser, let's create a new note, let's hover over it, and now here you can see we have access to this $sign. We can actually use that $sign to come in here, print that value out. And if we scroll all the way down, we'll see the type of element it is. So it's actually an HTML div element. So if we come back to Visual Studio Code land now, this node actually returns an instance of a node, but it is type of HTML div element. Let me just make sure. Div element, so that's very nice. Clone node will also return the same thing. So HTML div element, a clone of the note node. Queries the DOM for the template tag and creates a clone based off it. Based off it. Say here, let's say this handles the delete event on a note. Similarly, say here handles the edit functionality note. Editable is a boolean. We say here this is the, I guess the ability editable indicates if the element is editable. Set event listeners, helper method used to set event listeners of a note. Now I want to make sure, because sometimes anywhere that I use note, I want to make sure I did capitalize it just to make sure everything's consistent. So I'm quickly going to the comments here. See, for example, here, I want to signify that it's actually the note class. Okay, very cool. So we now have added the ability to edit a message. We can save it. And we also added these comments so that it's very clear what each one of these different methods are doing, just in case the developer comes along later and wants to understand more about it. So of course, let's come in here. Let us do a commit, and let's say added comments to note class and the ability to edit, save a note after creation. Beautiful. All right, let's go back to the browser now. And let's see what we have. We can now create a note, we can edit a note, we can delete a note, and now when closing the browser window, the notes will be stored, and when the user returns, the data will be retrieved. This will be a job for local storage. So let's figure that out now. All right, so back in our application note taker, what do we have so far? We have the ability to create some notes. Let's say first note, first message. We can say second note, second message. We can edit a note. Let's say here you want second note edited and second message edited. We can save the note. We can delete the notes. Everything's good. What we don't have right now is any sort of persistence. So what happens if we take some notes today, we close the app down, come back to our application, and guess what? All of our notes are gone. Now that's not really ideal, especially for a note-taking app, since the point of taking notes is to revisit them later at some point, sort of almost like a to-do application. So in order to help us in this endeavor, we're going to use an API on the window object called local storage that we have used before. Local storage is a very easy way to get some basic data persistence across different sessions. And let's see how we can go ahead and start using that right now. So what I want to do is, instead of using the raw local storage class, I want to, in a similar way that we have already created with our note class, I would like to create a storage class. And this storage class is going to be what is known as a static class. So I'm going to say export class storage, and it's going to have static methods on it. And what does that mean? Well, if we go back to our index.js class, you see that when we created this note, we essentially created a brand new instance of the note class because it actually has a constructor. We're going to pass in some parameters to it, so that way we can create our note, and then we're going to create generate note on it. We're going to call generate note on this specific instance of a note. All of our different notes are different instances, is why we're able to edit separate instances of notes. We can delete separate instances of notes, so on and so forth. But for local storage and for our storage class, well, we don't really need an instance of storage. We can sort of operate on the set and get and clears all in the context of all the notes. So that's why we're going to create a static version of this class. And just to get us off on the right foot, I'll go ahead and say here, by creating some comments, I'll say helper class used to manage Window.localStorage. Okay. The first thing I want to hear is I'll go ahead and create some methods like static get and static set. And if we actually go back to our browser, it's okay that it mimics the API that we have here. So it says here that this is the value is a storage object. So you see these methods have like get item and set item. So let's see what get item does. Get item takes a parameter of key name, and set item takes parameters of key and value. So we can sort of just mimic that. So let's say here to get, we will just give it get. And then for set, we'll do a key value. Now the reason that, we're not just going to simply call get item here with the key, because then really at that point we might as well use the raw local storage. But in this case, there's actually some stuff that I want to do ahead of time. There's some other logic that I want to do on top of calling the raw API, and that's why I'm also wrapping this in my own method. Okay, so let's think about what needs to happen, right? At the moment that our application loads, maybe the first thing we should do is check for the existence of a notes key inside of local storage. That way, if we already have the notes key, we can append all the different notes to our existing wrapper for our notes section. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's say that if, well, hey, actually, even before we do that, we need to import this new storage class, right? So let's say import storage from storage.js. We already have this get. So let's say if storage, just make sure again. So if storage.get, let's call it notes. Here we'll say render all notes from local storage. But we'll get to that in a moment. The first thing that we should do is figure out a way to start adding things to this local storage. And we know that'll need to happen at the moment that we create both the title and the message. So at the same time that we're also creating the note. So let's see how we can do that. Now, title and message, when it comes in, is going to be an object. And we can't simply pass an object to local storage. It needs to be a string. But what we can do with an object is we can actually JSON.stringify it, and we can use that as the basis for adding things to local storage. And we're also going to need to add this as an array, and that way we can map through our array or just loop through our array and append each of the individual nodes. So let's think about that here. So when we set an item, I think we should probably first check to see if there's an existence of notes already. That way we can just append something to the already existing array. And if there's not, we should create a new array and add the new note to it directly. So let's do that. Let's say if get if this dot get key any, we're going to call the key notes. Means that we already have something there. Else, what do we want to do? We want to create an array. So let's say const note equals, we have our value, and then we want to say we want to set local storage, set item equal to our key, which is really going to be notes. So we might not even need to set the key here. Set item notes, and that's going to be equal to json.stringify note. So because the key here is already notes, we don't even need to use this. So let me go back to our set here. Well, we actually haven't used our set here, but let's think about this. So we have a static set. If this dot get notes, if we already have something, we'll do something here. Else, going to create a new note, and we're going to set it equal to JSON stringified note. So let's come back to index.js, and right underneath the creation of the title and the message, let's say that we want to say storage dot set. This time we'll say, actually, yeah, we don't even need to pass a key since we're already handling that inside of storage. Very basic form of encapsulation. We'll let the class handle it for us. We don't need to worry about what key it's going to go into. And here, let's just pass in a value that's title and message. All right, let's go back to browser land. Let's see what we have here. I'm going to go to my sources. I'm going to hover over storage.set here. So first stored note, first stored message. Now, before we do anything, if I go to my application now and go to local storage, you'll see it's completely empty. Let's go back to sources and let's step through this and see what happens. Now we have storage.set. We can hover over this and go to our storage class. I'm going to come here. We'll also set one here. So we say if this dot get notes, which there are no notes currently, like we just saw in our application, we're instead going to create a new note. So let's see what note is. It's an array with one thing, title and message. And then instead of local storage, we're going to set an item and we're going to stringify that note. Let's continue here. Okay, cool. So now it appears on our UI like we already knew it could. Now, more importantly, let's go to our application and see what we have. Now you can see we have notes with an array of notes, and that is our first note that we created. Now, if I refresh this page, you're going to see there are no notes here, but the local storage still keeps the persistence, and we still have no note from before. So now if we go back to Visual Studio Code, we can actually now come back to this method, and let's see what we can do from here. So if storage.getNotes, which we are able to get from here, let's say const notes is going to equal, this time we're going to have to parse that so we can actually get the array. Let's say storage.getNotes. Now here we'll have an array of notes. So let's say notes dot for each note, we will now say pretty much the same logic we had up here, right? Const note equals new note, title, message. Well, here now we'll need to say note dot title, note dot message. That's going to be what our new note is. And then just for some, I guess, brevity, we can say new note. Well, we'll also need to, yeah. So let's say here, since I don't want to copy this, or maybe here we can say persisted note. Say something here. I'll say new note. Okay. Let's close this out. Let's go back to browser land. And let's see what happens. So go back to browser. I'm actually refreshing now, we're not seeing anything. So let's debug this and see what's happening. If we now go back to index.js, let's see if we make it past this point here. Again, going back to application, I do have a notes section here. So let me refresh. So as far as this is concerned, it looks like it's not reporting anything here. So let's come back here. If storage.getNotes, we come here. Well, of course, we're not actually returning anything from this function. So what is there to check? Let's come back to Visual Studio Code. Let's come back to our storage class. Say return local storage get item key. In this case, we don't even need to pass anything here. And remember that if we have notes, we need to make sure we JSON parse it. So let's actually handle this in the class. So we don't need to worry about it's again encapsulated away from us. So what do we need to change? We no longer need to parse notes from here. Since we're not passing a key, I think it makes sense to call this get notes. It's a little more descriptive. So let's say if storage get notes, this will be true or false depending on what we get back. Then const.notes, we don't even need to JSON parse it anymore. We can just now say storage.getNotes. Those will be our notes. So let's come back to the browser. Still seeing some issues here. So let's go again and go through this. If we refresh the page, we're still not getting anything here, and that's fine. Let's refresh here. Storage.get. Parse. Again, we haven't actually passed the key to get item, so what is there to retrieve? Let's come back to VS Code. Come here and let's say notes. And look at this. Now when I refresh the page, without me even having added anything, even created a message, we already see that we're getting the messages from local storage. We have some persistence. Now we have to continue seeing how we can continue adding things to this. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now let's see what happens when we add another note. So we already have the logic to see how we can get notes for the first time we load the application. Now the next time, we're going to set title message here. If we already have existing notes, what do we want to do? Let's see. So this dot get notes, well, we have already changed this, right? So this is just going to be get notes now. If this dot get notes, let's go ahead and get the notes, or even better, we can actually do, let's see what we can do. Our new notes are going to equal the existing notes that we had, which are going to be this dot get notes plus, now we're also going to say JSON stringify the new note that we just got, or in this case, the value that we got from here. But again, let's walk through this step by step, right? So here we're going to get an array. So if this is true, we know we already have something. Now, remember that the value that we set has to be JSON stringified. So what is it that we should do? Why don't we first get, let's be even a little more meticulous here. Why don't we first get our notes, say this dot get notes. Remember, this is a standard array now. To that array, I want to add my value, which is just an object. So I can say notes, right? We can do the same thing. Value. And now we can say local storage dot set item notes is now equal to JSON stringify notes. Let's go ahead and remove this part here. So what have we done? Well, for notes, we're getting the JSON parsed version of get notes, the complete array, and we're adding a new array based on this value here. Then we are setting the item to notes again, and we're stringifying all the notes we have here. Let's go ahead and save this here. Let's come back to our application in browser land, and let's see what happens. So I'm actually going to remove all the notes from local storage. I'm going to refresh. Now you can see we have nothing there. So I'll say first note, first message. Now I want to step through this so it's very clear what's happening. Let's come over here, create note. If this get notes, this is going to return false because we don't actually have that key yet. So we're going to come in here, we'll create a new note, and we'll set it in local storage. We've already done this before. Application, we have our notes here. Now let's add another one. Second note, second message, just to make sure my breakpoint is still there. Now let's create a new note. Now if this dot get notes, you can see the values are already coming here. What are we going to do? We're going to step inside of here. Now we have our value, which is an object. We have get notes. Come over here. Let's look at what notes are. Now it's array with two different things. So now we're going to set the item notes to JSON stringify notes. we'll resume here. We have our second note. And if we go inside of our application, and we look at our notes here, let me actually expand this a little bit. Now you can see we have this array of two objects with two different notes. Very, very cool stuff. And if I refresh the application now, you can see that we are getting that data persistence. It's not like the notes disappear, they're still there. Now let's see what happens when we delete notes, because if I delete a note from here and I refresh, you can see the note is still in local storage. It's still going to persist. So we'll need to handle that case as well. Before we continue on to figuring out how to delete a note and also having it persisted across local storage, let's quickly make sure that we commit what we've added so far. So I say introduced persistence layer via Window.localStorage. Awesome. Let's go ahead and continue. Apologies for that earlier. I actually did make a commit to introduce the new local storage persistence layer. I just didn't have my view on the terminal, so just want to show you all that we simply just added our commits or our untracked files to our staging area, and then we committed them using the same command we had used before. So let's go ahead and now wrap up the main user story section by figuring out how we can also make our deletions persist via local storage. So to do this, we are going to go to our storage class here. And what I want to do, I think it's a little bit better if we rename this class, since really we are setting things, but really this is to add a note. I think it's just a little more clear, and because of that, in the same way that I had alphabetized things earlier, I'm going to do the same thing here. And then instead of value, I think I will go ahead and use note. I think that's a little bit nicer. So let's say here we'll use note. Instead of value here, we'll use note. And then instead of having to pass in note there, we can just simply do note here. So we'll leave it like this. Finally, we'll have to add a new method here. So we'll say delete notes. And here we'll just be passing in a title. Now inside of our note class, we have to make sure that we import our storage class so we can also use it in here. So we'll import that from storage.js. And then at the time that we are doing a delete, we'll go ahead and call our storage.delete note, passing in the title of said note. Back in here, there's no point deleting anything if there is actually nothing to delete. So let's make sure we actually have notes to delete before we attempt to delete anything. So now that we know we have notes, I'm actually going to set this to a let instead of a const, since we're going to be modifying it in just a second. So let notes equal this dot get notes. And now let's go ahead and find the index of the note that we want to remove. So I'm going to say notes dot find index of the note, where note dot title is equal to title. And then finally we can say notes equal notes dot splice. This takes the index of the thing that we want to remove, where it's at, followed by how many things to remove. And then finally we can say local storage dot set item notes is equal to our notes. So this, let's now go back to our browser. I'm going to remove the notes key that we have here so that when we refresh, we have nothing to show. Now we'll say first note, first message. We will enter this. Look at this, we actually have an error. So let's see what this is. Storage set is not a function, of course. I need to modify the usage of storage set and index, and we'll say add note here. Now let's go back to browser land again. Let's refresh, make sure we have nothing in our application. Local storage, we don't, so let's do the same thing here. So first note, first message, and I actually do want to stay on the application view so we can see when we create it. Now we have our array of first note, first message. Let's say second note, second message, create that. Now when we delete, you can see that, well, looks like something didn't go right here, so let's figure out what happened. Looks like now we just have an object, which isn't really what we want. If we refresh the page now, we don't see anything. And if we look at the issue here, it says unexpected token O in JSON at position 1. So let's refresh everything. Let's come back here. Let's clear the application. And let's see what went wrong during the time that we were deleting things. Let's go to our sources. Let's go to our delete note. Let me refresh the application here. Do the same thing again. So first note, first message. second note, second message. If we go back to application, let's just verify everything's looking good. We have an array of 2 objects, first note, first message, second note, second message. Everything looks all right there. Let's now go back to our sources and let's see what happens when we try and delete a note. So I'm going to say delete note. Title is second note. If we have notes to delete, let's go ahead and get our notes. Const index, splice, notes are now equal to, right? That's fine. Local storage. Oh, we didn't actually go ahead and stringify this. We know that when we set an item, it has to be stringified. So let's go ahead and do that. We come back to our application. Let's just remove the key that we have here. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go back to our storage and make sure that we are doing a json.stringify here on notes. Go back to browser, refresh, first note, first message, second note, second message, and I'm just going to go ahead and remove this. I'm feeling good. If we delete this, we come back to our application, notes, second message, let's refresh. So it looks like the one that we deleted is actually still the one that's being persisted. So let's see what actually happened here. Let's now actually clear this again. Let's come back to our sources, set a breakpoint there. Let's refresh this. First note, first message, second note, second message. All right, so this get notes. We do have notes. Let notes, this get notes, const index. Let's see, so the index we found is 1. So our notes, 1, note, splice. Now if we go to splice here, oh, mdn splice changes the concept of an array by removing and replacing existing elements and or adding new elements in place. Deleted items r.space start the index I wish to start changing the array, but the return value, an array of 1 element is returned if no elements are returned. So do we actually still get, if we come back to our browser here, do we still get, what happens after we call notes.splice? Second note. If I just use that instead, I wonder if I can just stringify that. That's not really what I want though. If you refresh here, we still get second note. So remove 1 element, removed, myfish.splice. So do we just call, should we just call the method itself instead of actually saving it? Notes.splice, index 1. Let's try it out. Let's come back to the browser, go back to note taker, just to make sure. Let's delete, come back to sources, refresh this, say first message, first title, first message, second title, second message. All right. So we have that. If we come back to application, if we delete this, yep, now we see that we have first message. If I refresh this, you see first message is there. If I delete this, you see notes is now an empty array. And if I refresh, now we have that persistence for deletion. Now the next thing that we're missing is if I come back here and do first title, or we can just do first, and I create a note, we get it there. But now if I edit this and I say first something, you see that this doesn't actually change, right? Even if I save it, it doesn't actually change it. Now it just comes back to first. So let's figure out how to do that in the next section. Of course, before moving forward, let's make sure we go ahead and commit what we've just worked on. So it's a deletion persistence via Window.localStorage. Great. See you all in the next section. Before I continue with this last part of edit, I've realized there are some quality of life improvements and some refactoring that I should do to make this a little easier for us to handle. And really, I think it's just going to lend itself better to our organization. So this whole time, if you've noticed, when we're adding notes, we're passing in title and message. where really it would be nice if we can just pass in the actual instance of the note, since that's going to give us all the information that we need. So let's start from that point of view. And then also on top of that, I would like to give each note its own ID field. So instead of having to compare against titles, just in case things have the same title or different messages or the same messages, every different title should be unique. So let's go ahead and figure out how we can first do that. There is a great package that we can download, and it's this UUID package. We can also do it in the browser. So let's see what we can do here. UUID, it's not what we want. We want something, see npm UUID browser. It looks like there is a browser ready version of UUIDs. The ones that we want are version 4 UUIDs. So let me go ahead and copy the script here. What I'm going to do now in browser, not browser land, Visual Studio Code land, is go to our index.html. Top of my index.js script, I'll actually use that script there and I'll defer it. So it won't actually be available until all the HTML has already been loaded in for us. And now, if we go back to the browser, we can see the simple usage here. So it's just to call this UUID version 4 function. And what I'm going to do is on every instance of my note, I will create a new property called ID. But I'm just going to set it to a value right off the bat. So I'm going to call UUID v4. Now on top of that, I still want to keep these properties private, but to be able to make this a little easier for me, I'm going to create a new method that's called getNoteProperties, public method that will actually return the properties of this note instance. So let's say that we want a title. This will be our title. We want a message. This will be our message. And then finally, we want an ID, and this will be our ID. So let's start from that point of view. And then here we can say accessor for note properties. And this returns an object consisting of this note's properties. Okay, so now back in index.js, let's see what we can do. Now instead of adding the title and the message, really what I should do is let's delete this here. And here let's say storage.add note. This time I'm just going to pass the instance directly. Now my storage class, where I do add note, this is now going to be an instance of my note. So let's see what we need to change here. Const notes is this get notes note. Here we'll need to actually get the object that this note signifies. So we can say here note dot get note properties. Since we'll need an object to put in here, we can't just pass an instance. And then in local storage, we'll set the items to notes. And then on top of here, we'll also say note.get note properties. Now, if we look at this, we realize that we're actually using this in multiple places. So we can actually just say const note. Although maybe we should change it, just say note equal note dot get properties. And that way, inside of here, we can still keep using our note just like we were before. So let's just leave it at that and let's see what happens back in the browser. So now we come back to the browser. Let me go ahead and remove everything from local storage, refresh this. Let's go to our sources. Now we have this new add note thing. Let's see what happens. So we're going to say first title, first message. Let's create our note. Now we have this here, right? So ID, message, and title. We're going to now say note is equal to ID, message, and title. We're going to resume here. We still have our first note. Come back to application. You see that now we have the same object with ID and everything that we need. So if we refresh, you see that it's still there. Now, one of the nice things when I go to delete, actually let's go and create something else. Let's do second title, second message. Let's create that note. Second title, second message. Come back to our application. Let me see if I can actually come here. Oh, is this actually giving me a view to the local storage? Okay, nice. Now you can see that each one of these have unique IDs. So the nice thing about this is when we go to delete note, let me do a search for delete note. Here we can pass in an instance of our note. Now inside of here, we can say, or even better, we can actually just pass the ID here. So handle delete, storage.delete note. We'll come back to delete. Here we can actually have the ID. So if there are notes, we'll get all of our notes. Const index is notes find index, where the note dot this might be another issue here because we don't want to access the ID property like this. It's just not good practice. So for each note, let's think about what we can do here. We could get the note properties every single time. That might be okay. So let's do that. Let's say that the note.getProperties.id equals ID. And we do the same thing here. JSON.stringify.notes. So let's go ahead and try that out and see how it works. Let's come back to the browser. I'm going to refresh my page here. Still have the same persistence we had before. This time I want to go to sources. I want to go to delete note with the ID. And now let's come here and say delete this note. Now we have a unique ID. We're going to get all our notes. I'm going to find the index. So let's see what's happening here. Notes.findIndex. Oh, that's why. So in here, really, when we get the notes, we're just getting it from local storage. That to JavaScript, that's just simply an array of objects. It doesn't really know that it's a note instance. We don't know the properties we have on it. But if we do go back to get notes, let's look through this here. Go back to get notes. We do have all the necessary information here. We already do have the ID. So really, we don't need to get properties here. We just say note.id equals ID. Go back to Visual Studio. We already have the ID. We don't actually need to call that get notes properties. So let's see what happens once we've made this change. So back in our browser, just go ahead and resume here. So now let's say delete note here. Now have our index. Well, the index is -1, so that's certainly not what we'd like. Very interesting that it didn't find it, yet somehow it still removed it. Come back to our application here. You can see we just have the one. Let's come to delete note. ID. This is F9504. Look at this. This is actually 18B. So this is not even the same key. Very interesting. This dot get notes. Somehow, some way, still removing it. First note, first message. Let's create the note, delete the note. Still have that data persistence. Let's clear the key here, refresh. First, second, delete the note, refresh, delete the note, refresh. Data persistence is all working fine. Let's think about what happens now if we edit. We have delete note, add note. The edit now is where we have to focus on. So when we edit one of our notes, we already have this function here to handle that for us. We'll need to know what it was before we edited and also what it was after we edited it. So let's figure that out in the next section. All right, let's go ahead and commit everything that we've done up until this point. refactoring. Now let's go ahead and focus on that last edit note part. So what is it that we're going to have to do here? Before we move any more forward, I realized one small thing I need to change. So in index.js, we realized that every time, if we already have notes previously in local storage, it's actually going to ignore the ID that was set previously. And when it comes to create a new note, it will give it a brand new ID, but that's not really what we want. We want to use an existing ID if it exists, else as a default, we can actually create a new one. So let's come over here, set this equal to the ID if one is passed in, else create a new one. And then inside of index.js here, when we get to this part, we can actually say create the ID using the ID that's already set previously. Else, whenever we create a new note, we'll just give it a new ID by default. Okay, so let's go inside of our node.js and let's figure out where is it that we can actually handle the edit. So the edit needs to happen at the time that we save, which means that editable is going to be false, since once we save, we no longer want that to be editable. So we can say that if something is not editable, let's go ahead and edit it. So inside of our storage class here, let's say edit note. Oh, that's not what I want. And now inside of here, I'm actually going to need to pass in, I'd like to pass in the ID of this note and also the new text content of each one of these different fields here. So let's say this is going to be text content. And then for the note message, we'll also have our own text content. Storage edit note. Instead of storage.js, we're going to have an ID, a title, and a message. Let me very quickly, well, we can do that at the end. So similarly here, we can only edit something if we already actually have notes to edit. So let me just copy this real quick as a starting point. Let's remove this. So let's first find the note by the ID. So let's first say notes. Let's get all of the notes. Let's say const index is equal to notes, find index of the note, or the note.id equal to the ID. And then here we can say that notes at the index equals the title, and the notes at the index equals the message. So here we need to say title message equals message. And then finally we can do the same thing that we had before here, JSON stringify notes. So let's go ahead to the browser. Let's see how things are looking now. So everything's deleted now. Let's go here and let's say first, create that there, second, create that there. Now, if we come here and say, let me actually click here, second, let me go and, or rather edit the note. So second edited and second edited. When we save, we see that it was actually saved down here in local storage. So if we refresh this now, it'll actually keep the persistence. And of course, we can delete it, delete this one, refresh, and now we have nothing. So I believe at this point we have now completed the application. Let's go back to where we started. Let's come back to our Notes app here. We have the ability to create a note, we can edit a note, we can delete a note, and the data will now be retrieved via local storage. So really good place for us to end off here. That completes at least the base application as far as user stories are concerned. Of course, let's come back here to our code. Let's make sure we add everything, commit it, and we can say completion of user stories. And we will meet you all back here for some light refactoring and the bonus section of the application. All right, so I've decided for this last bonus piece here, if we go back to our browser real quick, let's go ahead and see what the requirement is on that last piece. I was looking at the last piece of the note-taking app, well, specifically this part here about Markdown. And while Marked is a very good Markdown parser, I think just for the length of the video at this point, I might skip this and create a video in the future where I just focus on this part and maybe just make a video specifically on Marked. So just for this case, I will only work on creating a date right now, and we'll just take it from there. After this bonus feature, I'll go ahead and work on some refactoring, and then we'll wrap it up from there. All right, so here I am back in Visual Studio Code. I'm starting on a fairly clean slate. I've removed all my open code editors and all the open files, so everything's looking pretty nice right now. What we're going to need to do to get this date functionality working is I'm going to go ahead here and create just an H6, and I'll give this a class of note date. I'm not actually going to create a new block or a new element as far as BEM file structure goes. This is just essentially a placeholder that I can then insert my date into. So if we go to Node.js, a couple things I want to take note of here. I'm going to give a default value of null to date because there's the case that we've already saved a date before. So the next time we read in from local storage, we'll use a date that is coming from local storage, or we'll just create a new date the first time that we create our note. So in here, I'll specify this.date and I'll say use the date that we already have, or and now for this next part, let me actually jump back to the browser. To get the date formatted nicely, I literally just looked up some quick function here on Stack Overflow. How do I get the current date in JavaScript? And this one has the most votes, but this one also looked the most concise, and it gave me a format that I liked. So all I'm going to do is just copy this piece right here, new date. So now if we go back to our code, that's actually what I'll use right here. So now we can either pass in the date from the local storage, or we'll just create a new one at the time that we create our new note. Let me actually just move this here, give it some more space there. And that also means that here in index.js, right after the ID, we can also pass in note.date. And then finally, down here where we're actually setting the text content of our different pieces, we can say right here underneath the title, we'll have this dot date be equal to that new property that we just created. And finally, let's actually send this off so that when we come and, oh, we actually include this here so that when it comes time in storage to create our actual note, we can actually get it from the note properties and create it correctly. So let's go back to the browser and let's see how things are looking for now. So back in browser land, I'm going to destroy everything in local storage. When we refresh, we don't see anything. Let's say first dated title, first dated message. When I create this, you can see now we actually have the date. And if we come over here and look at the object in local storage, you can see we also have a date there. So now when I refresh this page, you see that it actually uses the date from there. Similarly, I can say second dated title, second dated message, create note, same thing, same date. And when I refresh, we also get that there. Of course, everything else still applies. So if I want to come here and second dated title edited, let's say I want to save it, we can see it keeps everything there. So on refresh, we're still getting that. We can still delete notes, end up with an empty array, and on refresh, we still get that data persistence that we want. So I think this about wraps up the app. We have covered a lot in today's video, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to do so. I feel like myself, I have learned a lot. One of my favorite parts really was the content editable section. That's one of the attributes I hadn't worked on in a long time. And I also really enjoyed the fact that I got a chance to work with classes and modules, and I really hope that you all watching also felt the same way. For the next part of the video, what I'm going to be doing is focusing on just some slight refactoring, making things a little bit easier to read, and really making sure that every piece of functionality in our app is really just doing a single thing. We want to make sure that the single responsibility principle is followed so that things don't start to get muddied up in between a lot of other functionality and so on and so forth. So I'll see you all in the next section for our refactoring. All right, so let's start our refactoring journey here in index.js. I'm going to start just from like the top here. One thing I really quickly want to do just to clean up a couple lines here is I'd like to save these in some other file and make it its own module and export them. So I'm going to create a new file called elements.js, and I'll simply just take these from here. I'll remove these comments. So note form, and then I will export both of these. from here. Now we can simply import them. So import note form and notes wrapper from elements.js. Cool, just to clean up a little bit there. Now I also want to give this its own function. So let's say something like function handle note submission, which will take an event. And then I can literally just copy all this, put it here, and here let's say handle note submission. Looking good so far. There's also a distinction between creating a local storage note and also creating a regular note. So let's go ahead and do function to create local storage note, and then also just function create note. And I'll even create a function for this append here. It'd be something like function append note, and this will just take a note and append it. So when we create a local storage note, let's see, so new note, it's here. We can actually just return new note and we give it a note, and then this is already listed up there. So we can say return create local storage note. I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and now I'll simply just do storage, give this some space, and I'll say for each note what I want to do. I want to create a new note, but I also want to append it, so we can say append note, where my note is going to be create local storage note. I'll just do this, and I can actually even just make this the return value here. Clean things up a bit. Now we can remove all this. And then inside of here, this looks like it's a good candidate for create note. Right here we will return note, and then we will do notes wrapper dot append, and here we'll say just create note. So I have three things in here: notes wrapper append dot create note. Now we have methods to create a note. Right, we put this here since our related storage add note. We return the note here, create a local storage note, and if storage note. Okay, so things are looking pretty nice here. Let's go back to our browser. Let's make sure nothing blew up. So object. Okay, so it looks like we are getting this object here. Let's see what the issue is. We're creating a note here, returning the note, append, which will generate a note. Same thing with create local storage note, append note, create local storage note, note. Also do the same thing. So let's see why that's happening. Let's come back to our browser. Let's use our handy dandy debugger. Let me actually go to the application, delete everything in here, refresh. Let's go to storage, and now let's do this one here. So dd append create note. What do we return here? Date ID, we return an object for the note. Create note, notes wrapper. Oh, are we not? Notes wrapper dot append create note. Oh, here we go. I don't actually call my function here. I did call append note down here. I was supposed to call append note. I didn't call the right function. I was supposed to call append note here. So let's do this. Let's remove this. Come back to our browser. Let's go ahead and just remove everything. Deactivate breakpoints. Let's refresh. dd, create note. Nice. All good. All right, so going back to our code, we'll leave it at this for now, and then we will now revisit our next section. All right, so continue on here with our refactoring session. I'm going to go ahead and focus on this storage class. A couple of things that we can do here just to clean things up a little bit. So I'm going to first start by focusing on this add note class. So let's look at what's happening here. We're getting our note and we are getting the properties of the note, and then we're using that note to append it to this array if it already exists. Else we're just creating a new array with that note. But let's see what we can do, right? So if we actually remove this notes variable and simply just entered it here and then remove notes here, you can see that both of these things are essentially doing the same way, or rather are essentially doing the same thing. So I'd rather have something of like this will always add a note, right? It's always going to add a note, but only sometimes is it going to add also the rest of the notes. So something I'd like to do is see if I can make that a little more clear, a little easier to read. So why don't we first save this? Let's say that for our notes, the array is going to be get note properties. So this will be the initial array that we create always at first, sort of like how we're doing down here. And then we can say, well, if we also have notes, so if this get notes, let's say, if that's also true, then let's actually set this equal to the notes that we currently have on line 6, plus all the notes that we have already written up until this point. Right, so that conditional helps us change that, and then at the end of the day, we can simply just say local storage dot set item, of course, for our notes. Now we just have json.stringify notes. It's a little bit easier, a little bit nicer. Notes will not always be an array, just like we sort of had it before, but this makes it a lot clearer. Again, we're always going to have at least a note be an array the first time, but then the second time we'll just spread everything we have so far, or rather spread everything we have here, and then also just spread the new thing that we just added, and then we'll just stringify that into notes. Something else is these, we don't really need to do these checks for delete note and edit note because the only way to delete a note and get a note is to have multiple notes. So that's a little bit redundant there. And then for deleting of a note, we can actually really condense this down into one line. But I'll split it up into some. So let's go here and let's say set item, and then let's do notes here. And then inside of here, what do we need to set it to? Well, we need to set it to the filtering, right? We want to essentially filter everything with a note ID does not equal the current ID that we've just passed in, right? And that will effectively keep everything else that does not have this ID. Oh, there we go. Here we go. I'm getting my parentheses mixed up. Okay, cool. Now we can effectively just remove the rest of this. Now that becomes very easy to read, very nice. An edit note, well, it sort of is well, it's probably the clearest way of doing it, right? So we have all our notes, and then we're finding the index based on that. I mean, something we really could do is, well, notes will still have to be included down here, so I'm going to keep the variable around, but we get all of our notes, we find the index of the note we're looking for, then we modify the index of the notes to the title of the message, modify those two things, and then just stringify it back. So that's probably a good way of doing that. And then of course for our get notes, we simply just do the parse. So I'm going to go back here now and start adding this JS doc to help us out here. So helper class used to manage Window.localStorage. I'll also come over here and I'll say, what does add note do? So add note adds a note to Window.localStorage. I'll remove this here, and I'll say the note to add deep note. And here we'll say given an ID removes the note with, or how about we just say removes the note with the given ID, the ID of the note. And we know this is actually going to be a string. Oh, say here this is a string. And really when we're adding a note, let's come over here and look at when we add a note. Add a note is note. This is really of type note. Now I don't think the way that I have it, I won't be able to use it like this. We can leave it like this, but this doesn't really know what it is since we're not actually importing it here or anything, but we can leave that there as a comment. Say edits the title and message of the note found using the ID of the note, the new title of the note, and the new message of the note. These are all going to be strings, so what I'm going to do here is just select all three of these. Well, actually, I'm going to do this. Nope, just 1, 2 back. And finally, get notes returns the list of notes in storage. And here we can say returns a list of notes. Okay. Hover class used to manage adds a note to Window storage. The note to add moves a note with a given ID, the ID of the note, edits the title and message of the note found using the ID. Perfect. So now we've gone ahead and refactored our storage. And then really the last thing we have to do is see if we can focus on the note class a little bit. So I'll get to that in a moment. All right, so in our note class, something I think would really be nice is right here, this handle edit editable. Sort of weird to pass in another parameter here. It would be nice if really each one of these things has their own way of handling. When I say each one of these things, I mean the edit and the same functionality. So let me actually do that. Let's create a new method here. We'll denote it privately by prepending it with a underscore. Here I'll say handle save. I'm actually going to copy all this here. We know that when it's a save, this is going to be false. So let's actually just make both of these false here without having to pass in a parameter. And then we don't even have to check for if it's editable or not. We just know that this will take place. So now I can go ahead and remove this from here. It's only really relevant to handle save. And then finally, let's go to here. Let's just remove these values. So this dot handle delete. I believe we can pretty much leave it like this so it's a little bit cleaner. Now everything has, oh, of course we have to make sure that we change this. And here we'll say handles the save functionality of a note. Just like that. This no longer returns anything, so we can remove that. So now we have handle save, handle edit, handle delete, get template. This really is the best way of doing this, so that's nice. Get note properties is something I'm a little bit torn on because it seems like we just need it for such a particular reason. It's only ever used once. It'd be nice if I can change this some other way. Now, really, if you really think about it, these are private and they should be private to the class. Get note properties. I mean, it's the best way for me to be able to get or reference to them without accidentally changing them. I really don't want people to just use the API and say, oh, hey, here is how to update the title, just reference it directly and update it. These things should be done through creation of different notes. It really should be done through either the edit functionality that we have or through the constructor the first time that you're creating it. So I think we'll go ahead and leave that here. When we get the template, the text content is equal to all these different things, so that's okay. I have it in this order because that's the same order that it's reflected in the HTML as far as where these show up in the template, so that's okay. And then finally here with the different default parameters that we have, of course, if it's a new note, we'll set the ID, but if it's an existing note, then we'll go ahead and pass in the ID, and similarly with the date, especially when we're retrieving from local storage. So that being said, I believe this is a good place for us to end here. Let's go ahead and just make sure that things are still working on the browser. Want to make sure we haven't lost any information there. So let me just close off the DevTools. Let me actually delete everything in local storage. Let's refresh this and see. So let's say well, I guess fist will do. All right, let's say second. I'm just all over the place right now with typing. Third, third, cool. Let's say four. Okay, and let's just check out some of the functionality, right? So first thing I want to do is let's see what happens when I refresh. Okay, I get everything. If I delete this note, you'll see it's gone, and if I refresh, it's still gone. Let's come over here and modify this. So it looks like now our edit functionality does not work. And the reason that is because if we actually go to edit, let's go to edit here, we can see that this is still set to editable, when really it should be true. Just remove this. Now, this could be a good opportunity to, yeah, it could be a good opportunity to update the content. So let's do that. Let's say set content editable, and here we can change editable. Again, just to reduce some of the code. Let's come over here. This will just be set to editable. So here, now we can say this set content editable to false. And finally, this set content editable to true. Nice. Now, something that I would like to do here, if you're coming from a background of .NET, you know that .NET has names parameters. I would also like to do the same thing here though. So instead of just passing in false and true, there seems like kind of random values. Let's say here editable is false, and then here editable is true. And that way it's very clear what we're saying, right? Set content editable, editable true, set content editable, editable false. We also get the nice destructuring here so we can use it. Here we'll say upper method used to set the content editable attribute of an element. Oh, there we go. And this param, I guess really it will just be editable is a string. I guess we can say param0, sure. Param0 is object containing editable information. Okay. So let us now go back to the browser. Let's refresh here, making sure everything's still okay. Looks like some things aren't actually okay. Now when I'm refreshing the page, I see that I'm actually not getting. Oh, actually, wait, this is weird. Okay, there you go. It was actually a hiccup on the page. For some reason, it was taking a while to load. Let me just close some tabs up here so I do the same thing. Okay. Want to edit this like we had before. Let me just close this off. So edit notes. Awesome. Let's say edited notes. Can't edit the date, but I can edit this. My edited message. Go ahead and save note. So that's all good. If I refresh the page again, we see it's there. Let's go ahead and delete these two, refresh the page again. We see that's still there. And if I delete this and refresh the page again, we see that now we actually don't have anything left. And if we come to local storage, we'll see that we indeed have an empty array here. So we have finally come to the end of our application. It has been a long one, but I'm so excited that you all have been able to join me on this fun journey. I really hope you all have learned a lot. I sure have. I'll go ahead and upload this to my YouTube, and I'll also upload it to GitHub so we can all enjoy it. Hopefully we can get some people to contribute to it, make it cooler, make it look nicer, so on and so forth. But stay tuned for some upcoming videos. I'll make sure to get back to that bonus about the marked parser because I think that's pretty cool and will allow us to explore some other unique third-party APIs. Once again, thanks for watching and happy coding.